Hi there, AP Euro students, and welcome to today's lecture. In today's lecture, we are going to cover two sections. The first one will be 1.3, the Northern Renaissance, and then the second one, which is very short, will be 1.4, the printing press. Your objective for our first lecture is to explain how Renaissance ideas were developed, maintained, and changed as the Renaissance spread into Northern Europe. Now, the defining characteristic of the Northern Renaissance is a concept we call Christian humanism. Christian humanism. So Renaissance ideas and culture and spirit began to arrive in Northern Europe in about the mid-15th century, around 1460. That's when we start to see the first examples of Renaissance humanism in Northern Europe. Primarily, this will take place in the Low Countries, which are basically the modern-day Netherlands and Belgium, in France, in Germany, and in England. And the goal of the Northern Renaissance was really to change the way that people viewed the world. This is a much more, I would say, progressive and reformative interpretation of humanism. Humanists in the Northern Renaissance were interested in the idea of morality and ethics, and they were particularly drawn to debates over religion and the Bible. But not so much the validity of religion, but how religion, specifically Christianity, could be improved and reformed. At first, there were only a few interested scholars, but because the spread of humanism in Northern Europe was very, very gradual. Now, the best way to consider Christian humanism is to think of it as a combination of the classics, so that classical literature that we saw revived and celebrated in the Italian Renaissance, combined with early Christian scripture. And by early Christian scripture, I mean some early texts from the first few centuries of Christianity, during the time of the Roman Empire and just afterwards. The combination of these two elements is what created Christian humanism. So Christian humanists looked to some of the church fathers as original sources for Christian texts and knowledge, as well as the Bible. So they didn't just look at the Bible, they actually sought out what would be considered sort of the classical texts of Christianity, written by some of the men who are considered to be important founders of the Christian church, like I said, in those first few centuries CE. Christian humanists also stressed the use of reason. They emphasized the Christian values of love, faith, and hope. And they were really interested in the development of an ethical way of life. So again, you can see this focus on sort of reform and progress, on improving the human experience. This also led to a new emphasis on humanist education, I should say. And as a result, new schools and tutors and even universities began to emerge in Northern Europe that embraced a humanist education. And in Northern Europe, we tended to see more traditional kingdoms than, say, Italy. And some of these monarchs will also create positions at court for humanist scholars to advise them. Another significant difference between Christian humanism and Italian humanism is that Christian humanists were not as negative about the Middle Ages. You might remember that Petrarch, the father of humanism, characterized the Middle Ages as a period of darkness, but Christian humanists were not quite so condemning. Christian humanists actually saw the Middle Ages as a formative period of European culture and civilization. Overall, they were a lot more, again, optimistic and reform-minded. Now, the most important Christian humanists for the entire Northern Renaissance is inarguably Desiderius Erasmus, and you can see his portrait here to the left. So this is Desiderius Erasmus. Desiderius Erasmus was a famous scholar and writer who formulated and popularized the reform program that became Christian humanism. He united the classical ideals of humanity and civic virtue with the Christian virtues of love and piety. Erasmus is considered to be the leading intellectual of his lifetime in Europe because of this idea of Christian humanism. He was very, very popular. He had many patrons of the nobility, of monarchs, including the Holy Roman Emperor at the time. And one of the things that's actually very interesting about Erasmus is even though he embraces a lot of those traditional Christian values of love and piety, and he also embraces the classical ideals of civic virtue and humanity. At the same time, he was very reform-minded. So what this means is he was actually very critical of many church practices. He was sort of, you can think of his agenda and his ideas as trying to get back to basics, right? What was the true meaning of Christianity? So as a result, because he studied all these early texts from Christian fathers, from the early centuries, as a result, Erasmus emphasized this idea of inner piety. So inner piety is basically your internal faith and what makes you a good Christian in your heart and in your own personal faith and dedication and behavior. So he emphasized inner piety, and he de-emphasized a lot of the external forces of religion that were present in the Catholic Church, things like sacraments and pilgrimages, the idea of doing penance, the idea of worshiping saints and relics. He believed that Christians should really focus on the scripture of the Bible and some of those early church fathers. And this idea of emphasizing inner piety as really the true meaning of faith actually reflects the Renaissance sense of the dignity of the individual. This is actually an example of individualism in the Renaissance. And we will see, of course, how these ideas about religion become even more influential in European history. Erasmus also believed that scripture, biblical scripture, should be accessible to everyone, right? And not limited to interpretation by the church and the clergy. And so one of Erasmus's most notable accomplishments is that he wrote new translations of the Bible with his own commentary. However, this last point is important. Erasmus did not directly challenge the authority of the church. He did not argue that there should be a different type of Christianity. He did not argue that we should get rid of the Catholic Church. He pushed for reform, all right? So he wanted the church to reform, to change, to embrace this idea of inner piety, get rid of some of those external forces, emphasize scripture, kind of like get back to basics, back to like what would Jesus do type of thing. And because of these ideas, Erasmus is sometimes described as the person who laid the egg that Luther hatched. He laid the egg that Luther hatched. Now, what that implies is that we will see in our next unit that this German monk named Martin Luther will actually lead a direct challenge to the Catholic Church. And he embraces many of these same ideas as Erasmus. And in Luther's challenge, he will actually be successful in creating a whole different branch of Christianity, which is known as Protestantism. But that's another story for another day. However, Erasmus laid the foundation for that. Like we said, he laid the egg that Luther hatched. Another notable Christian humanist is Thomas More, who was actually a close friend of Erasmus and also a scholar and intellectual. Thomas More was very devout, a very devout Catholic. He was also an advisor and held an important position at court for King Henry VIII. And he actually has quite the run-in with King Henry VIII, and that's going to be a fun story that I will tell you when we get to Henry VIII in the Reformation. But I just want you to have this context that Thomas More is also another Christian humanist, and he wrote a famous text called Utopia. And think about that idea of what a utopia is, an ideal world. And so he uses the idea of Christian humanism to suggest what he thinks would be the ultimate utopia. for Europeans. All right, the last point I want to address here is this idea of religious reform, which really is a central component of Christian humanism. Because Christian humanists wanted to improve society, they wanted to change the way people viewed the world, right? They were progressive, they were reformative. And at the heart of this, many Christian humanists believed that inner piety, meaning your inner faith, would lead to social reform. All right, so good, faithful people would create a good society. Good people would create a good world, basically. And this would bring about reform of the church and reform of society. And Christian humanists recognized that you had to first change humans in order to change society. Now, this is actually a fairly positive and optimistic view of human nature, especially compared to someone like Machiavelli in the Italian Renaissance. And we will see in the next unit that the Protestant Reformation, in some ways, was the work of humanists moving beyond what they considered to be the constraints of church theology. So Christian humanism in the Northern Renaissance is very, very important for the influence and the foundation of the Protestant Reformation that we will see begin in the 16th century. And this idea of religious reform and kind of the spirit of change that came with the Northern Renaissance also coincided with the rise of European nation states and these new monarchs in Northern Europe, especially in England and in France. And so when we get to that section, which is 1.5, many of these new monarchs, as they start to establish some early nation states and expand their royal power, will incorporate elements of Christian humanism into the changes we see politically and culturally and socially as well. All right, moving on. Another significant difference that we see between the Italian Renaissance and the Northern Renaissance has to do with their art. The Northern Renaissance overall will have a greater religious focus and a lot more portraiture than, say, the Italian Renaissance. So, for example, the Italian Renaissance artists tended to focus very much on technical skills, such as linear perspective and those new artistic techniques we discussed. And also, Italian Renaissance artists believed that the human form was the primary vehicle of expression. So they put a lot of emphasis on the humanism element of their work. You know, even if it was a religious theme in the painting, the focus was still the humans and the people. Italian Renaissance artists also painted frescoes frequently, but that was because they lived in a warmer, drier climate, and that's why we see a lot of Italian churches with famous frescoes painted on the walls and the ceilings, whereas Northern Renaissance artists tended to use wood panels, more traditional oil paintings, watercolor, and engravings. We also don't see as much sculpture in Northern Renaissance art. And Northern Renaissance art is usually recognizable because of the incredible level of detail and symbolism found in the paintings. All right, so Northern Renaissance art tends to have a lot more detail and symbolism in the paintings. And also, the cultural life of the Northern Renaissance was often dominated by the courts of kings and princes. And this is reflected in the enormous amount of portraiture that existed in the Northern Renaissance. And of course, we can identify portraiture as another example of individualism. Many monarchs and princes were patrons of Northern Renaissance artists, and much like the church embraced the spirit of the Renaissance and recognized that art equals power, so did these early monarchs. And this could actually lead to competition between various countries or cities in particular to have the most impressive churches or altar pieces, again, using art to show off their power, their wealth, their influence. The subject matter of the Northern Renaissance also tended to be much more religious overall. However, within that, we see a humanizing of religious figures. Especially as we get into the 16th century, that's the 1500s, Northern Renaissance art was dominated by lots of portraits, lots of scenes of nature, right? Things that I would call safe secularism. So yes, we're going to see a lot of religious paintings, scenes from the Bible and famous scenes from Christian history. And the secularism of the Renaissance, of the Northern Renaissance, I should say, will not include like Greco-Roman imagery, because that was considered very pagan and might offend the Catholic Church. Instead, their secularism included things like portraits and nature scenes, like what I call safe secularism. And later, when the Protestant Reformation is underway in the 16th century, there was also a concern about this idea of iconoclasm. I'll spell that for you, iconoclasm. Iconoclasm is this idea of utilizing lots of religious images in art and architecture, and we will find that Protestants tended to distance themselves from that practice. That became more of a Catholic characteristic. And so in the places of Europe that became Protestant, we see a decline in the use of even religious imagery in art because of that aversion to iconoclasm. All right, so again, the big differences between the Northern and Italian Renaissance in terms of art is the North tended to be more religious. They practiced safe secularism in their subject matter, and also their art tended to be more detailed and more symbolic. All right, so let's take a look at a couple of the most famous artists from the Northern Renaissance, starting with Jan van Eyck, who was Dutch, I believe. You can see that he practiced pretty early on, right, in the early 15th century. He was one of the first artists to use oil paint. And while he painted secular and religious art, he was very well known for his portraits and his altarpieces. And I have an example of each of those here for you to take a look at. The painting on the left is probably Jan van Eyck's most famous work. It's called Giovanni Arnolfini and His Bride. This is an oil painting on a wooden panel, currently located in the National Gallery of London. And this is a good example of precise portraiture. You can see that the humans do not have the same level of realism or even idealism that we might see in the Italian Renaissance, but they're still fairly accurate, still a lot better than medieval art. But what's really notable in this painting is the detail and the symbolism. This is a marriage portrait between a wealthy Italian merchant and his bride, and everything you see in the painting has some type of symbol. The dog, the shoes, there's oranges on the back table, the color red, the way she's holding her dress. And actually, if you were to look in the mirror behind the couple, you would see a perfect reflection of the room, including the artist painting them at the time. So that's an example of the level of detail that was present in these paintings. You can also see that the technical skill is maybe not as precise or as perfect as the Italian Renaissance artists. Perspective is utilized, but it is not as strong and, as carefully perfect as we see in some of those Italian paintings. On the right, we have an example of one of Jan van Eyck's altarpieces. This is a panel from an altarpiece. This is called Annunciation. It's another oil on panel. This one's actually located in the United States at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. And this depicts a religious scene, the moment of Annunciation by the Archangel Gabriel to the Virgin Mary. Now, this is also an example of what I might call sneaky portraiture, because the Virgin Mary in this painting looks very similar to a real-life woman named Isabella of Portugal, who was the wife of Philip, the Duke of Burgundy, who likely commissioned this painting for an altar in a church. And so again, you may remember from the previous lecture on Italian art, that patrons would sometimes ask artists to depict the patron or members of their family in the art as, say, religious figures or other characters, to demonstrate to everyone who saw that art that the patron was the one who paid for it. And again, that was a subtle way of advancing the patron's power and influence. Moving on, we have another artist named Albrecht Durer. He was a German painter, and he was a contemporary of many of the major Italian artists like Da Vinci and Raphael, and in fact, he was friends with them, and he studied with some of them. And like the Italian artist, Durer became very famous at an early age. He was very successful, very popular. One of his patrons was the Holy Roman Emperor at the time. Durer is also considered to be a Renaissance man because he was multi-talented. He used a lot of forms of media in his art, so he was a multimedia artist. Although primarily a painter, he was also a writer. He's known for his wood engravings, his altarpieces, his portraits, his self-portraits, paintings with watercolors and oils. But he also wrote theoretical treatises on mathematics and perspective and proportions, right? So he was a consummate artist and writer. All right, so let's take a look at two examples of his paintings. The first is St. Jerome in the Wilderness. This is the one on the left. This is an oil on panel painting, and this is a biblical religious scene. And you can see again that while there's a lot of detail and while there's certainly elements of the artistic Renaissance, it's not as technically perfect or refined as we might see from some of those Italian masters. And then on the right, we see a rare self-portrait of an artist. This is also oil on panel. This is currently located in Munich, Germany. And this is a really bold and unique style of a self-portrait. It's very direct and confrontational, right, with the subject of the painting staring directly at the viewer. There's a rigid symmetry to it, right? And some art historians have even suggested that Albrecht Durer's image in here is somewhat reminiscent of Christ. And you can sort of take a moment to consider what that might mean and what that means the artist thinks of himself, possibly. But regardless, Albrecht Durer was a very famous, popular, talented German artist of the Northern Renaissance. Next, we have Peter Brugel the Elder. Peter Brugel the Elder was a Flemish painter. So Flemish means he was from this region of Flanders, which is more or less northern France and modern-day Belgium. And he is famous for his peasant and landscape scenes. So he is a good example of art that has that safe secularism, and art that was also influenced by many of the forces of the Protestant Reformation, because as you can see, he painted primarily in the 16th century. He worked in the Netherlands, which became a center of Protestantism eventually, but also the Netherlands had a lot of religious conflict as the Dutch Protestants challenged Catholic control of the territory under the Holy Roman Emperor and then later the King of Spain. So there was a lot of religious turmoil in the Netherlands where he lived and worked. And so that was one of his motivations for utilizing safe secularism in his art. So he avoids a lot of religious imagery because he doesn't want to offend the Catholics or the Protestants. That's why he's known for these paintings of peasants and landscapes. In fact, he's one of the first artists to feature peasants as subject matter in his art. That earned him the nickname Peasant Brugel instead of Peter Brugel. All right, so let's look at a few examples of his work. In the top left corner, you see a painting that is called The Peasant Wedding. This is an oil on panel painting, currently located in Vienna, Austria. And you can see there's a use of perspective here with the room receding into the background. There's the element of humanism, as the focus is obviously humans celebrating a wedding. There's a lot of activity and interaction and emotion and gestures, right? So many elements of Renaissance art, right? Those themes. So that was on the left, sorry. On the right, we have a painting called The Harvesters. Again, this is depicting peasant life. Not a very glamorous moment of peasant life, though, because these are peasants taking a break during the harvest, right? And this is a good example of combining kind of like a landscape painting with also some elements of humanism, because you can see the expansive landscape in the background of the painting, but in the foreground of the painting, there's still a group of peasants lounging around, taking a break from the hard work of the harvest. And below these two paintings, you see one of his, I think, more interesting paintings that's called Netherlandish Proverbs. This is another oil on panel painting. And this is an interesting painting because there's all these kind of like proverbs or saying that are literally depicted in the painting. And what's fun about this painting is you can actually, if you Google this painting and look it up, say in Wikipedia, it gives you all these examples of Netherlandish proverbs like kill two birds with one stone, or a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, like all those type of sayings. That's what I mean by proverbs. And you can identify all of these things in the painting, right? And that's why it has this sense of like sort of chaos, and it also has themes of absurdity, and some might even suggest the wickedness and foolishness of humans. This painting is definitely influenced by another Dutch artist who we're going to see on the next slide, named Hieronymus Bosch. But again, if you want some entertainment, I would encourage you to look up this painting in Wikipedia, and you'll see a lot of examples of how those proverbs are literally depicted. It's very fun. All right, our last painter for the Northern Renaissance is one of my personal favorites. This is Hieronymus Bosch. Hieronymus Bosch was a Dutch painter, but he wasn't as prevalent as some of the other artists we've discussed. There's only 25 known paintings of his, and honestly, very little is known about his life. His work is known for its fantastic imagery, its detailed landscapes, and the illustrations of religious concepts and narratives. And he has a very unique, very autonomous style, which was later influential on other 16th century artists of Northern Europe, such as Peter Brugel the Elder. The painting in front of you is arguably Bosch's most famous painting. It is called The Garden of Earthly Delights, currently located in the Prado Museum of Madrid in Spain. And this is what we call a triptych painting. It's something you might see in a church. It's a triptych because there's 3 panels, so there's 3 different scenes of the painting. And the panels will read from left to right, and this is a religious themed painting. On the left panel, we see God presenting Eve to Adam. The center panel is this garden full of nude people and oversized fruit and fantastical animals, and it's just a sense of, again, absurdity and chaos. And this is a type of painting you can look at for hours. I'm not even joking, and you will always be seeing something new, right? If you look closely, you can see all these strange happenings of people riding different types of animals, and animals harassing people, and people interacting with oversized fruit. Like it's just insane what you see going on in this painting. And then the right panel is supposed to depict hell, which gets even weirder, right? We see a bird eating a person. That person has music notes written on their butt. Oh no, that's the birds flying out of the person's butt. But there's another butt that has music written on it. There's a pig dressed as a nun kissing a person. There's giant ears, as you can see. It's just so weird and absurd. The YouTube link there at the bottom leads to something interesting. I mentioned that I think it might be the center panel. Not sure if it's the center panel or the right panel, but you can clearly see music notes written on someone's butt. And someone actually, read that and composed it with the music. And if you click that YouTube link, then you can actually hear what that Hieronymus Bosch butt music sounds like. But yeah, as I said, this is just such an entertaining painting. Again, if you kind of are into this, into art, and you're finding these lectures interesting, I would encourage you to maybe look up an example of this on the internet where you can zoom in and take some time to examine all the crazy things that are going on. It is, and it's so fun. I have a poster of this in my classroom that students can take a look at if we ever go back to the classroom, obviously. All right, now let's look at our second section of the day. This is very short, I promise. This is section 1.4 about the printing press. The objective for this lecture is to explain the influence of the printing press on cultural and intellectual developments in modern European history. All right, so the invention of the printing press is a major turning point in Western history. It is probably one of the more important parts in this overall transition from the medieval era into the modern era. It is definitely one of the most important technological innovations, like I said, in all of Western history. The creation of the printing press introduced the era of mass communication, which permanently altered the structure of society. It allowed for the unrestricted circulation of information. This is sometimes called the democratization of knowledge, meaning it makes knowledge accessible to more people. And without the invention of the printing press, it's likely that we would not have seen the same level of success with the Renaissance, with the Reformation, or even the scientific revolution. This technology was necessary for the success of all of those significant transformations. So the printing press was developed in Europe by a man named Johannes Gutenberg around 1450. I'm not going to say that he completely invented this technology from scratch, because that would deny the contributions of other civilizations. In fact, woodblock printing and paper had actually first been developed over in China in the 8th century, and that technology would reach both Europe and the Arab world via Spain, which at the time was controlled by Muslims, around the 13th century. Then once it got into Europe in the 14th century, a Flemish craftsman invented an oil-based ink and a wooden hand press. And that oil-based ink in the hand press is actually what then made possible the invention of movable metal type by Johannes Gutenberg, who was living in Germany in the 15th century. So you can see often what happens with technology is one person will invent something, and that allows another person to expand upon that invention and improve it, and then another person, until we get to big transformative pieces like the printing press and later on the steam engine when we start talking about the Industrial Revolution. So the printing press, which you see here, became very popular, and printing shops spread quickly throughout Europe. There were over 1,000 printers by the year 1500, and by that point they had already produced 20 million copies of various books and literature. And printing actually became a new industry that allowed for new professions, new jobs. We start to see jobs like librarians and booksellers, publishers, typesetters, editors. But what's most important, of course, is the effects on European society that we see from the printing press. The printing press allowed for the spread of new text, literary criticism, and most importantly, the dissemination of ideas. The printing press encouraged the development of scholarly research. It also allowed for the standardization of certain text and literature, especially a lot of ancient and medieval literature. It facilitated conversations, right? The spread of knowledge and ideas led to conversations, and it would be heavily utilized by the Protestant reformers of the 16th century. I think it's very safe to say that without the printing press, the Protestant Reformation would never have been successful. And ultimately, the growth of literacy, right, because we will see an increase in the literacy rate. So the growth of literacy, the expansion of vernacular literature, that means non-Latin literature like German, French, Spanish, Italian. So the growth of literacy and the growth of vernacular literature will also contributed to the development of national culture in some parts of Europe. So in addition to its many social and political and economic and cultural changes, the printing press will also influence the formation of some national identities and national culture in Europe. But of course, that's a very, very gradual process that unfolds over many centuries. All right, that brings us to the end of our lecture. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to do your write-up and tune in for our next lecture, 1.5, on the new monarchs. Enjoy the rest of your day, students.